It is now my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce local luminary,
Yay!
man about town, pillar of the community, official seat warmer at the sanctuary. What else? Mad scientist, OG Krampus, all these sorts of things. Eric Schallberg.
Yay!
Thanks for coming out, guys. It's kind of hard to follow up Stephen. I do not have anywhere near the education that he does, but I'm going to do my best. And actually, a lot of the stuff that he talked about ties in really well to the stuff that I wanted to talk about.
You got this.
So in the beginning was color.
Yay!
There we go. All right, so we've talked about some really ancient computing and computations, and I'd like to talk about how we went from systems like that to the modern computers that we have today, like the things at your house, your laptop, your work computer, your smartphones. Like how did we get from there to where we are now? So let's see if I have this right. There we go. Okay, so we're going to fast forward a few millennia to the 1820s. So believe it or not, in the 1800s, computer was actually a job description. It was something that people did. You saw a lot of the tables that Susan was talking about where people had written out, oh, we need to add a month in here and stuff like that. That was the job of a computer. So it was still a really big thing in academia. And in the 1800s, doing computations like that became potentially profitable to Charles Babbage, largely because of war, because we all know that war is really profitable. When you're rolling out artillery onto the battlefield and stuff like that, it costs a lot of money, lives, time. So you want to make sure that when you launch a cannon shot that you get it right, that it hits the wall that it's supposed to hit to rather than people. So they had entire rooms full of people that would calculate out these trajectories that are, if I'm on this hill and that's what I want to blow up down there, this is how much gunpowder I need to use. This is what angle it should be at. And that took a tremendous amount of time to calculate that. And when you're at war, you don't really have that much time. So what Charles Babbage did was he sold the British government on, hey, I can make this hand crank machine that will calculate all of these things for you. Of course, the British government said, man, this is awesome. Sure, here's my money. Just take it. So 20 years later, he still had not actually built the machine. There's two different major reasons for this. One of them is that he got sidetracked because initially he was concentrating strictly on calculating these trajectories. It's a specific type of equation. And towards the end of that 20 years, he started realizing, wait a minute, I can make one of these hand crank things that will calculate anything. So he kind of stopped working on what is known as the difference engine. He started working on the analytical engine, which was a general purpose computer, and that also did not ever actually get created. Needless to say, the British canceled his contract, and he died without ever seeing any of his things being built. They did get built, and this is a good example of what one of them actually would have looked like. The other reason was metalworking. Metalworking in the early 1800s just wasn't up to snuff to be able to build parts like this repeatably. So we're going to do another fast forward real quick to one of his friends. This is Ada Lovelace. She actually was one of his friends. She was the daughter of Lord Byron, the poet, who you might be familiar with. And she was very, very highly educated. And when Babbage did a talk about the analytical engine in Italy in the 1840s, she was really excited about this and totally got what he was talking about, and someone commissioned her to translate the Italian speech over into English so that the English people could understand it. In the process of translating it, she also added on a little section that is simply called notes, and these are her notes off to the right. And what this is the very first computer program. So Ada Lovelace was the very first computer programmer. She did this at the age of 27 in the mid-1800s. Unfortunately, she died a decade later. There's going to be a lot of it. So we're going to fast forward again, right? So we have this problem with metallurgy, like we just can't make all of these parts. We have this great theoretical design of how we can make a general purpose computer. So we're going to fast forward to the mid-1900s, the height of World War II, and let's see what a computer looks like in World War II. So in World War II, a computer is still a person. There were entire rooms full of women that were performing these exact same calculations. The same calculations that you would use for the orbits of celestial bodies and stuff like that. These are now used for my plane is moving at this speed, at this height, I need to bomb Dresden. When do I release the payload doors? Very, very important stuff. So there was a lot more attention, a lot more energy, a lot more money put into how can we make these calculations faster. So, this is really the birth of the electronic computer age. Before that, obviously Babbage was a mechanical thing, it was hand cranked, and there was this genius named Alan Turing that said, hey, maybe we can do this with electricity, because we have a lot of that. So this is Alan Turing. And to your right, you see what is known as a Turing state machine. Most of you won't know what it means, but this is the foundation of how all modern computers are actually built. It's a really simple concept, and it's basically, you have this infinite tape that on each square can have a 0 or a 1, or it's just blank. And you can tell the head that is reading this tape, do I move forward if it's blank, or do I move backward if it's blank? Do I move forward if it's 0? Things like that. If it's 0, do I make it a 1? And using these very, very basic instructions, you can perform basically any computation. So he came up with this idea and was like, hey, we can probably make an electronic computer that can do all of these things for us. Unfortunately, he was so smart that he never got the opportunity to build that either. It's very similar to Babbage. Instead, he wound up spending all of his time cracking the German Enigma machine, which is how they encrypted all of their communications, and then won World War II. So it was a pretty good side project. Alan Turing later went on to be one of the founding people behind artificial intelligence, some of the ideas behind how we could potentially store human minds in computer memory, but he was arrested in 1952 for homosexual acts, which was actually still illegal in Britain. He, just pled guilty and said, sure, I'll take the punishment, which at that time was chemical castration.
Oh.
And 2 years later, killed himself. So Alan Turing is one of my personal heroes, right up there next to Nikola Tesla. And like Tesla, I can only imagine where we would be today if that had not been the case. So we move forward, and in 1948, America actually took up the task of building the first electronic computer. And this is what you see here. This is the ENIAC, the Electronical Numeric Integrator and Computer. So it was the first general purpose computer. There were actually electronic computers before this, but it was the first one that could perform any kind of calculations. It had approximately 17,000 vacuum tubes in it and weighed 30 tons. So this is another view in History Museum of what the ENIAC looks like. So around the time that this was being built, there were people at Bell Labs that were saying, man, vacuum tubes cost a lot of money to manufacture. They're incredibly brittle. They create a lot of heat. Maybe we could come up with some other thing that wouldn't be so prone to breakage, right? And there were some other problems that came along with vacuum tubes. Like you can see that this is, encased in a big steel box. Every now and then, because inside that steel box it was dark and really, really warm, which is a nice place for cockroaches and spiders and things along those lines. Every now and then, the computer would start sending out bad answers, things that were very obviously wrong. So someone would have to go inside there and remove the cockroaches and remove the spiders. This is the thing you might know now as debugging. This is where we actually So the guys at Bell Labs, 1 year after the ENIAC was completed, actually did what they set out to do. This is a replica of the first transistor that was created. So transistor did the exact same thing that a vacuum tube did, except that it was, there were no moving parts. That was the really big thing. There was also no glass, so it was less breakable. And anybody that has played guitar before, you probably know that you've heard the term, vacuum or solid state. The reason that this is called solid state, again, is because there are no moving parts. And this is where we start to really make a huge push forward towards the modern era of computing. Because there are no moving parts, and we can keep making these transistors smaller and smaller and smaller. So when you're programming a computer that's built on transistors, you use what are called punch cards. Believe it or not, punch cards date all the way back to the 1802, the Jacquard loom. This is a Jacquard loom, which would have a huge series of punch cards that were fed into it so that it would automatically weave the exact same pattern over and over again. So this was kind of a known technology, obviously 150 years old by the time we built these computers. So they used the same technology. This is a Fortran punch card. So this is how you would program these computers that were based on either vacuum tube or transistor. Unfortunately, this was really expensive and very error-prone. But it did lead to the era of miniaturization.
Oh dear.
So all of a sudden, because we have transistors, it's not just nation states that can afford computers anymore. Now state and city governments can afford them, and banks can afford them. And what is a bank going to do when it can afford something like this? It's going to analyze cost. And this happened, and Grace happened. So this is Grace Hopper. So in 1958, sorry. 1958, there was a group of people from academia, from business, and from the government that got together, and they tried to figure out how do we, kind of normalize and standardize what a programming language is. Because basically every computer up until then had its own. So the banks ran some numbers. How much does it cost me to get a single program, just one, a single program on these computers? And the answer to that was $800,000. So in modern times, that would be $16.5 million for a single program, which further convinces me that I was born at the wrong time. So what Grace and a lot of her colleagues did was they came up with this thing that was known as COBOL, which was the first widely adopted general purpose programming language. She was also a rear admiral in the Navy in World War II. She had programmed the Mark I computer, and because of all of her massive achievements, she was actually referred to as Amazing Grace. So the next big leap forward, and I'm sorry about going as fast as I am, I'm trying to crush a lot of stuff in a small amount of time. Integrated circuits. So integrated circuits were the next big thing, and this was done by a guy named Kilby at Texas Instruments. And he said, wait a minute, we've got all of these transistors, but we keep having to solder them together over and over and over again. What if I could, just keep reproducing the same group of transistors over and over and over again to do the same thing? And this is what's known as an integrated circuit. An integrated circuit is the basis of every single modern computing device that we have now. After this, the only thing that we really did was made things smaller and smaller and smaller, cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and faster and faster and faster. So he did this prototype in 1958, patented it in 1959, and to give you an idea of the importance of this, won the Nobel Prize in 2000. After the internet had already exploded, he won the Nobel Prize for this invention. So again, smaller and smaller, faster and faster, cheaper and cheaper. On the right is a modern AMD processor. This has 10 billion transistors packaged onto it. And around this time, there was a guy at Intel, the co-founder actually, named Moore, who came up with Moore's Law, which basically said that for the next 10 years, the amount of transistors that we can pack into a given area is going to double every year. And he was right. In 1975, he revisited that and said, now it's going to take 2 years. The industry since then has kind of normalized that to every 18 months. And as you can see, up until today, this still holds true. And I'm going to see if I can jam through the next things really quickly, because we're running into quantum mechanical problems now. Like the wires that we're using are 10,000 times smaller than a human hair. So you wind up with interference basically at the subatomic scale that is starting to happen. So how are we going to continue with Moore's law with these physical limitations? And the way that we do that is through alternative ideas of how we actually perform computations. One of those is just go ahead and adopt how the quantum scale works. And long story short, normally we're dealing with zeros and ones that go into a computer and a 0 and 1 come out. So in this example, we have 4 bits, the zeros and ones that are going in, and 4 bits coming out. If you harness the quantum state of photons and electrons, they can actually be both at the exact same time. So at the bottom, you see the quantum computer that is calculating every single possible one of those at the same time and giving you every single possible result at the same time. Another example of how we're going to continue with Moore's law is adopting physical laws, things that happen in just our day-to-day being, and that is DNA. So this is actually, my senior project was on DNA computing, and this is a notorious problem in computer science. This is known as the traveling salesman problem or the Hamiltonian path. So what we're trying to do is figure out how can I visit all of these cities and sell vacuums and not repeat the same trip I've already taken, not visit the same city. For humans, this is really easy. For computers, this is really hard. A computer will have to go through every single possible combination of these things before it can say, this is your answer. This is a really easy example of it. As you might imagine, if there's 10,000, 10 million different cities that you need to visit, it can take longer than the life of the sun for a computer to actually calculate. So what Edelman in the late 1990s came up with was, well, what if I take DNA? We know that how these base pairs work. A bonds with C, G bonds with T. So what if I just take a sequence that I randomly generate and say that is Atlanta? And I generate another sequence and say that is San Diego. And then I take the latter half of Atlanta and the first half of San Diego, put those together and say that is the leg between the two of them. With this idea, he's then able to basically just print out all of these DNA strips and say these are my cities, these are my various paths that are available, dump them into a test tube full of amino acids, shake it up, and because he knows how many cities he's supposed to visit, not more, not less, you can use a process known as gel electrophoresis to get the correct length of DNA, and by reading that backward, it solves that problem. I went over it, sorry.
Yes, very good. So, thank you. We still have a good 10 minutes for questions. So.
You were rushed to that last part. Do you want to take a couple of seconds and just bring that? Because I got it, but maybe everybody else.
I'm the smartest one here, man. Right. So basically, the way that it works is because we know that the base pairs of DNA will always only bond to their what's known as a Watson complement. So again, A to C and G to T. If I say, let's say Atlanta is AATT, right? And then San Diego is CCGG. Then to make the path between the two of those, I would do AAGG. That would be the path between the two. Because I know that the A's on the path will bond to the T's at the end of Atlanta. And vice versa, I know that the C's at the end of that will bond to the G's in San Diego. So it will join those two cities together. So that's basically how it works.
So it's creating a complement of each other.
Yes.
Oh.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then because you know how many cities you have, and that's your desired result, that you only want to visit them once, you know how long that strand should be. The strands of DNA that you have to seed it with get tremendously longer because you also have to make sure that each individual city is not a complement of the other cities. So you have to keep getting longer and longer and longer, but still the physics of the way that DNA, it still works. In practice, it is tremendously slow.
Do you have to know a finite beginning? Do you have to know the front end, or is it complementary pairs?
No, you do have to know beginning.
So if you know the front end, then you can do the complementary.
Right, exactly. And it actually, the real traveling salesman problem, this is Hamiltonian path that I was talking about. The real traveling salesman problem also puts weight on each of those paths, and that gets much more complicated. That was solved with DNA in 2007 and involves physics and chemistry that I don't understand. I started reading it, and when it started talking about melting DNA, I just kind of lost it. Nicole?
So I'm going to ask a question that I don't know if I can even ask it, let alone get an answer for. Why do you need to use DNA? It seems like it's one of those kind of problems that as long as you have a system where you can create the kind of conditions under which you can create matching ends, that you can do it. I mean, DNA provides a good kind of physical substrate that works for that, but it seems like you could use any kind of like put things in a bowl that are going to attach in certain ways as opposed to something that's necessarily DNA.
I agree with you. I would challenge you to come up with something simpler than 4.
You mean 4 units? So it's basically
Right.
binary.
It's because DNA is based on the 4.
It's a quaternary.
amino
Is that so? It's a binary goes to quaternary.
Yeah.
And so could you imagine doing? I mean, you could go to any number, and that would increase the complexity of the kinds of matchings that would be required.
Mind is blown.
Sorry, like I said, I don't even know if I can ask it. So.
I totally understand where you're coming from, and I think the reason that Abelman used DNA again was because DNA is so simple. It's just those 4 base pairs, and we know how that works. If we find life on an alien planet that has 16 base pairs, or 60.
But we could create that.
Yeah, that is probably true. Yes.
So I heard a thing, I don't know, some time ago about that somebody had managed to store data in DNA. Is that related, like the works of Shakespeare in DNA? Is that a related, like
Yeah.
the solid state?
Right. It is the same
Story.
basic concept where you're just encoding that into those base pairs, and then it'll just copy itself over and over. Oh no, Mr. Huff.
Aside from DNA and to some extent the quantum computers, did anybody try any non-binary systems early on that you came across?
Nice job. That was a good softball. Yeah, it was actually one of the things that I wanted to include initially, but I realized I was going to be running over time anyway. In the 70s, there was a guy that created a computer called the Moniac, which was for modeling how a nation's finances would work, and it was all based on water. So, I mean, it was just a big tub of water at the bottom with pumps that fed up to the top, and it would have various dams and gates and things like that. And he would use that to figure out, like if I want to increase investment from the business sector, what dam do I need to release? Do I need to give tax breaks to people, or do I need to give tax breaks to, the corporations and stuff like that? And there were actually a couple of countries that used that, although not very long.
That was a whole Terry Pratchett book.
Was it really? That was a Terry Pratchett book.
The water systems for the results, making money. Terry Pratchett.
Huh. I'm gonna have to read that.
Yes.
So, are there any non-Western models, early on, when you're talking about, hundreds of women sitting around doing computation? Were there other strategies employed in China, for instance, or Japan, or do you know? This is not so far out of your...
Yeah, it certainly is. I really don't know the answer to that question. Like the stuff that I learned was very strictly Western. I would think that if China had beaten us to it, that they'd probably be known for it.
Yeah.
Can I have a beer now?
That's
Eric says
an
no.
important question.
Go ahead.